Cars Garage. In this video, I'll be working on the Serpent SRX8 GTe long wheelbase, the shock bag. So let's get started. Be careful opening up the shock bag. You don't want to cut any of the O-rings that are in the bag. They are individually sealed in a separate bag, but you don't want to cut that. So we don't need the chassis for now. We're going to need it in a later step. So I'm going to set this aside. Kind of surprised the pistons for the shocks are not machined. X-rays like that, but the X-ray drives pretty well. But nice quality on the shock bodies. Nice big bores. And included comes aluminum shock caps. That's very nice because most kits don't come with that. It's probably another $20, $30 upgrade. The bottom caps are plastic. So this one bag comes with some pistons. And then there's some extra pistons here. So in the bag is a 1.2 piston. And on these parts trees, I see a 1.1, 1.3, 1.4. There's another piston here that's blank. Looks like you can drill it out yourself. Thing on these. So in the manual, it doesn't say which piston to use when you're building it. My assumption is to use the pistons that are in this baggie because they're not on the parts tree. We have two different spring bags. It does say 34.5 pounds on this one and 37 pounds on this one. So I don't know if in the manual it says which is which. It does not. It just shows how to build it. I think you're gonna have to look up the setup sheet. So I'm gonna go ahead and check the Serpent website to see if the stock or box setup shows what piston to use and what spring to use. So the setup sheet shows to use the 6-hole 1.1 piston. Silver springs up front, black springs in the rear. Yeah, the color is slightly different on the springs, and it does make sense to have the stiffer spring in the front than in the rear. So just remember that. Kind of surprised why they would give the 1.2 pistons. All right, so I did some research and I'm not going to use the 1.1 pistons because they look like they're molded. They're probably not going to be perfectly round, and don't want to, cut them off the tree and then try to make sure that it is perfectly round. So I'm not going to worry about that. I'm just going to use the 1.2 6-hole pistons that came in that baggie because they do look more round. They're already trimmed and ready to go, so I'm just gonna go with these. There is a slight nub on there, so I'm just gonna take a nail file and just file it gently to make sure that it's smooth. That seemed to do the trick. Nice and smooth. Barely took any material off. Just basically knocked off the nub buffed it and got it nice and smooth, so that'll be perfect. So I'm just gonna take a microfiber towel and just wipe it down. Make sure there's no sanding material or anything like that on it. So now we're gonna need a shock shaft, piston. We're gonna need a 3x6 by 0.5 shim or washer and a M3 nut. It's not gonna be a nylock nut, just a normal M3 nut. So we can put together the shock shaft, and we're also going to need some Loctite, a wrench to tighten it down, and shock pliers to hold on to the shaft so it doesn't rotate when you're tightening it down. Okay, so on one side of the shaft the thread is smaller and there's a larger thread. The larger thread is actually going to go into the rod end, so we're going to be working on the end that has the small thread. So we're going to go ahead and install our 3x6 by 0.5 washer. Then we're going to install the piston itself. The top side is flat and the bottom side is not, so take note of that. So install it with the flat side facing up. You'll see that washer sits just like so. So now we can add some blue Loctite onto the thread on the shaft and install the M3 nut. Go ahead and hold it with your shock pliers. Don't want to over tighten it because you can actually warp the piston. So just get it shouldered up and then a little snug, and that's about it. And then I'm gonna go ahead and wipe off any excess thread locker that's on there. Kind of surprised I didn't use a nylock nut here. Most shocks I've seen will either use a nylock nut or some type of C-clip. I'm wondering if they're doing this just to save on the height because the nylock nuts are usually taller. All right, so next I'm gonna go ahead and just build one shock and get it ready to put the fluid in, and then I'll just build the rest of them and get to that point, fill up the fluid, and go from there. So next what we're gonna need is the shock body itself. We're gonna need the lower cap, and we're gonna need our O-rings and spacers. So it looks like we're gonna need 2 of the smaller O-rings and 2 of the spacers. The spacers look like they're made out of Delrin. One is a thicker spacer and one is a thinner spacer. So take a look. There's a thinner spacer that has kind of a lip on it, and then the other spacer is just normal. And it doesn't say, but you're going to install that lip facing up. So it's going to be facing the shock itself. So install that, make sure that the lip is sitting down in there. Next, we want to grease the O-rings. It says to use silicone oil on the O-rings in the manual. I personally like to use grease on the O-rings and then install the shaft using the oil. That's just been how I've been taught to build shocks, and they don't leak. So I'm gonna do what I know. Basically, put the O-ring in the grease, cover it up. Don't be shy, and install that O-ring. Next, we're gonna install the larger flat spacer, and then lastly, the other O-ring. And then we can install the bottom cap. Be careful when you thread this on that you don't cross thread it. So what's a nice way to do this is actually rotate it backwards until you feel the start of the thread, and then you can rotate it clockwise in the proper direction. It is a pretty tight fit, so I'm kind of surprised it doesn't go on that well. It's just tighter than, I mean, it feels like it's cross threading, it's not, but it's just a really tight fit. So next we can go ahead and open up our silicone shock fluid. I like how the bottle comes with a nice spout. So what we're going to do is just put a little bit of this silicone fluid on the shaft, and then just work that fluid around. And when we install this shaft, we want to rotate it so that way we don't cut the threads. So go ahead and insert the shaft and rotate as you go in. There we go. Nice and smooth. All right, so next we're gonna need a rod end along with a ball. So we can go ahead and install our ball into our rod end. And take note, because it does look like the other rod ends in the kit. There's a small end and a large end. Install it using the large end, otherwise you're going to have some tight movement. It's probably going to bind. Moves nice and free. So I'm going to put a little bit of oil on the threads to help install the rod end. It's going on there extremely tight, so probably best to hold with some shock pliers. So we're going to measure the length from the bottom shock cap to the rod end, and it's supposed to be 27 millimeters. So we're at 29. Okay, right at 27. Perfect. Now we're going to need our spring collar and a large O-ring. So you can put some silicone oil on the O-ring. It'll help with installation into the collar and also for adjustment. Fits nicely in there. And we're going to go ahead and install this onto the shock body. The lip will be facing downward because the spring will perch onto there. So an easy way to install this and not cross thread it is to actually push up against it, rotate backwards, until you feel the start of the thread there. And then you can start threading it on. That way you don't cross thread it. And I'm just going to go ahead and thread it all the way up. I have another thing that I do. I put a little dot of nail polish on the collar itself once it's installed, and I have it lined up to the front of the car. I'll put a dot on each collar. That way when I make adjustments, I know that, you know, I'm doing a quarter turn or eighth of a turn, and it helps me get close to my adjustments. Okay, this one's done. I'm going to set this aside for now, and I'm going to go ahead and build the rest of them, and then we'll continue. All right, so that's finally done. The shocks are mostly assembled, and we can put the shock fluid in the shocks now. So let's see if it sort of fit my buggy stand. A little larger than what I normally run, but this should do. So preferably use a stand, and basically what you're going to do is make sure the shocks are fully extended, which they are, and then fill up with the shock fluid. Probably going to leave like 2 millimeters or so from the top. And then what we're going to do is we're going to move the shock rod slowly up and down, and we're going to let the air bubbles that are underneath the piston escape. So see if I can get this on camera. So I'm going to slowly move the shock shaft up. Almost all the way up. You don't want to move it all the way up, because then you're going to grab air and bring it underneath the piston. So now you see when I start moving it down, some air is coming out. So do that a couple times on each shock. And I actually like to rotate when I do that, so you can kind of see there's a bunch of air bubbles in there. So do that one more time. I'm going to go ahead and do the rest of them, and I'm going to set these shocks aside for maybe an hour or so and let all the air bubbles kind of escape. So I'm going to go ahead and set this aside and let the air bubbles escape, and make sure that each shock is, you know, ready to go before moving forward. So it's nice to have a stand. I know they also make like shock vacuums where you can put this in a little stand and then use a little hand pump to remove all the air, and it makes building the shock so much easier and quicker. I don't have one. If you do a lot of builds, probably like I do, you should probably invest in one. They're about $50. I've seen them from anywhere from 50 to 150 bucks depending on size and brand. But yeah, so let's set this aside, and then I know the next few steps are to actually, you know, make sure to complete the shock. But what we're gonna do is actually, I'm gonna set this aside. We're gonna prep the chassis with the mounts for the lower part of the shock and the upper part of the shock on the shock towers. And then we'll come back to this, finish them up, and then we'll be ready to install it onto the chassis right away. Let's go ahead and grab the chassis. And we're gonna need, see, these inserts. Let's see if they're all the same or if we have some different ones front and rear. It looks like they're a little different front and rear. So put these here so you can see. So a little different front and rear. The holes in the bottom are wider apart on this one, and these are closer together. So it looks like the ones closer together are going to be the ones that go on the front of the vehicle. So grab 2 of those. So we got 2 of these. I think they're bi-directional, so you can use them on either side. So we've got, say, 1 for either side. I'm going to set this aside for now. We're going to need that soon, but let's just focus on the bottom. We're going to need, it looks like, an M4 by 16 set screw for each side. And then we're going to need an M4 by 18 screw as well. So 1 on each side. So the M4 by 16 set screw is going to go on the inside of the vehicle, and the M4 by 18 is going to go on the outside of the vehicle. And we're going to install the M4 by 16 set screw first, and we're going to use some blue Loctite since it will be going into this aluminum piece here. So just go ahead and apply some Loctite on both of these screws, and it's going to install with the pivot point facing the outside of the vehicle. So I have the M4 by 16 set screw. It's going to install. I had a hard time installing this part. I spent more than 30 minutes trying to get it to work. I ended up chasing the threads multiple times and it still didn't work out. So you'll see moving forward what I think about the design. So we'll get to that. Alright, so I think this is a pretty bad design because the screws are tight in the control arm when you're threading it in. And so when it gets to this thread, it may not be clocked perfectly to actually start the thread, so it can cross thread real easily. So I remember on the x-ray, these holes weren't, you can't thread them in to this hole. It's larger than the screw, and so it goes in easily and you can thread it onto here. So I think it's a pretty bad design. I think if you're doing it, if you have a drill, maybe drill these out, and that might help with installation so you don't ruin your part. So I'm taking my time and making sure I don't cross thread it or anything like that. I had to chase the threads multiple times to make the screws even go in. All right, so the lower mounts are installed. We can install the upper mounts. So for the upper mounts, we're gonna need the standoffs. It doesn't quite say, but there's these aluminum pieces, like, so they're like basically gonna be washers, and we're gonna use M3 by 25 button head screws like this. So the button head screws are gonna install in these washers to make it kind of look like so. That's a very nice way to do it. And we're gonna add some thread lock onto here since it is going into these aluminum pieces. So the stock setup in the front is the third hole from the outside. So just take note of that. Looks like I'm able to get it pretty tight without actually holding back up on there. So that's good. Can go ahead and do the other side. Can go ahead and do the rears as well. So we're gonna need these two pieces here. We're gonna need two M4x18 button head screws and two M4x16 set screws. So before I even install these, I'm gonna make sure I can get the screws in there. Yeah, these seem much better than the front ones. So hopefully they'll install a lot easier. But still kind of think bad design with the plastic, like these threading into the plastic itself, because that can cause the issue of cross threading. So here we are on the rear of the vehicle. We're gonna install this. There's 3 holes in the arm, and we're gonna install it in the innermost hole and the outermost hole. So in the innermost hole, we're gonna have the set screw, and the outermost hole is gonna have the button head screw. So I'm gonna go ahead and put a little bit of Loctite in here. What I'm actually doing is I'm just threading in the set screw until I see it in the hole, then I back it out, and then I'll place this in, so that way it's not taking forever to screw in by hand. But at the same time, I don't want to cross thread it. If I'm going into aluminum, I don't want to use an electric screwdriver. I want to be able to feel it by hand, make sure that it's installing properly. And that installed much easier than the fronts. So definitely some quality control issues with this. Let's flush. And again, I'm using the electric screwdriver to go in most of the way, but not until I hit the aluminum piece. I want to be able to tighten it by hand and feel it to make sure it's not cross-threading. And that installed so much easier than the fronts. So let's go ahead and do the other side. Okay, so that definitely went together a lot easier than the fronts. So let's go ahead and install these standoffs on the rear shock tower. We're going to need the standoffs, 2 of these conical aluminum washers, and we're also going to need 2 M3x25 box head screws. And the screws or the standoffs are going to install in the second hole from the top. All right, so that's installed. So now we're ready to go back to the shocks and complete the assembly. So I'm gonna go ahead and set the chassis back aside and grab the shocks. All right, so the shocks have been sitting probably for about an hour now. Go ahead and inspect them one by one and see if there's any air bubbles that are in the shock. I'm just going to go ahead and stroke the shock up and down, see if I see any bubbles, and I do see some bubbles coming out from underneath the piston, so probably going to let this sit for a little while longer. A few more bubbles in that one. So there's still a few air bubbles in the system. I moved the shock piston up and down a few times to see if there's any more trapped air. There was, so I'm gonna go ahead and leave these for another 30 minutes or so and come back and check them, and we'll move on from there. So for you, it won't be any time, but for me, I'm gonna go grab something to drink. All right, so all the air bubbles are out of the shocks, so we can go ahead and finish building them. So we need our bladders and our shock cap. So we need to go ahead and insert the bladder into the shock caps. So we can go ahead and do that. So now what we're gonna do is we're gonna grab one of our shocks. This is gonna get messy, so grab yourself a microfiber towel or so. So we're gonna go ahead and put the cap on, but not all the way on. We're gonna put it maybe 3/4 of the way on. Okay. And then next what we're gonna do is we're actually gonna find the hole in the shock cap and make sure that is pointing up. And then now we can start our bleeding process. What we're gonna do is slowly compress the shock and let any excess air or oil come out of that hole. Okay, so the shock is fully compressed. I'm going to keep it compressed, and then we're slowly going to screw the cap down. And as we do this, more oil will come out. And you're going to need to hold it with a 17mm wrench on the shock body, and then use a tool, something like this, to tighten down the shock cap. And once you feel the shock cap shoulder up, you're good. So the shock has a lot of rebound. I mean, it rebounds 100%. But that's what the steps show. It doesn't say anything about building a dead shock. This is the method they show in the manual. So I'm gonna go ahead and leave it like that and see how the car runs, and if it needs to be rebuilt to be completely dead, then we can rebuild them and do that. Okay. All right, so the shocks are bled. I had to re-bleed some of them just to make sure that they're all even. So now we can go ahead and completely assemble the shocks. So we put the black springs, which are 34.5 pounds, on these two. Just put the spring on, and then take note of the little thing right here on the turnbuckle, or on the rod end, I mean. And it's nice that it just kind of clips into place, so it doesn't rotate or anything like that. So this shock is ready. You can go ahead and get the other ones done. There we go. So these are the 37s. These are going to go in the front, and these are going to go in the rear. So we got the front and the rear. Set this aside. We can grab our chassis. So we're going to go ahead and install the front shocks first. We're going to need two of these little plastic bushings. We're going to need two M3 flange nylock nuts and two M3 by 10 screws. So these are the rears, these are the fronts. So we're going to go ahead and put these plastic bushings on first, and the flange portion of the bushing is going to go on first, like so. And now what's kind of cool is that it has a Serpent logo on the shock. We want that to face the front so that everybody knows what you're running. Okay, so then we can take the M3 nylock nut and install that. It looks like there's going to be a little bit of play in the top mount. It looks like the nylock nut is going to sit flush with the screw, so just take note of that. And then on the bottom mount, we're going to use the M3 by 10 screw, and since it's going to go into aluminum, we're going to go ahead and put a little bit of blue Loctite on there. There we go. Go ahead and do the other side. Okay, so the front end is done. We can move on to the rear. In the rear, we're going to need our rear shocks that have the black springs. We're going to need two of these plastic bushings, two M3 nylon lock nuts that are flanged, and 2 M3 by 12 screws. So basically install it the same way, with the flange portion of the bushing facing the standoff. Then we can go ahead and install our shocks. And then I'm going to add some blue Loctite onto the M3 by 12 screws because they're going to go into aluminum. All right, that concludes the shock bag. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. A few issues with the install. The front shock mount on the bottom that's made out of aluminum, the threads were kind of mangled up or didn't line up. I think it's kind of a bad design. But other than that, everything went smoothly. Hope you enjoyed the video. Please like and subscribe if you did. It does really help the channel. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you all in the next one where I continue with the build in bag 10. 2 more bags left, just bag 10 and 11. So stay tuned for that, and I'll see you all in the next one. Thanks.